You are sitting at a family dinner. Someone pulls out an old photo album. There you are, tiny, wrapped in a blanket, eyes open, staring at the camera like you are still working out what everything is. Someone says, "Do you remember that day?" You stare at it. You really try. That room, that blanket, that version of you. Nothing. And not nothing in a sad or poetic way, just nothing. Blank. Because that baby is you. Has always been you. You were awake in that moment, fully awake, taking in more sensory information per second than your brain ever would again at any point in your life. And you have absolutely nothing to show for it. Not one face, not one feeling, not 1 second of it. Most people laugh and close the album. Move on with dinner. But if you actually sit with that feeling long enough, the question underneath becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Where did it all go? And what does it mean that the period that shaped you most completely is the one you cannot access at all? Because here is the thing. This is not a minor quirk of biology. The answer to this question reaches into how your personality formed, why you react the way you do in relationships, and why some fears arrive before you can name them. So let us go through exactly what happened, layer by layer. The instinctive answer most people reach for is that babies have small, undeveloped brains, not capable of storing memories yet. Simple biology, nothing more to examine. That answer is wrong, and what is actually happening is considerably more interesting than most people ever find out. To understand where your earliest memories went, you first need to correct a fundamental misconception about what memory actually is. Most people picture it like a recording. Something happens, the brain captures it. The footage sits in storage waiting to be retrieved. Clean, accurate, preserved. But memory does not work that way at all. Every single time you remember something, your brain is not pressing play on stored footage. It is rebuilding the experience from scratch. It pulls fragments of emotion, sensation, language, and context from different regions of the brain and stitches them back together into something that feels like a continuous memory. Every single recall is a reconstruction, which means memory is not fixed. It shifts slightly each time you access it, and the entire process depends on one specific structure buried deep inside the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for converting short-term experience into long-term memory. Without it functioning at the right level, experience does not get stored. It passes through your mind like water through an open hand, present for a moment and gone before you even noticed it was there. When you were born, your hippocampus was one of the least developed structures in your entire brain. It would not reach the level needed for stable long-term memory formation until somewhere between age 2 and 3. Some researchers place that threshold even later depending on the individual. So the first face you ever saw, the first voice that calmed you down, the first time you felt completely and entirely safe in someone's arms, all of it was moving through a brain that had not yet built the architecture to hold it. Not because those moments did not matter. They mattered enormously. They just had nowhere permanent to land. But the hippocampus is only the first part of the explanation. And this next part is where things get more structurally interesting. Think about how you hold on to a memory as an adult. Something happens to you and almost immediately your brain begins narrating it. You wrap words around the experience. You give it a shape, a cause, a before, and an after. That narration is not just how you describe the memory to someone else later. Language is actually part of how the brain constructs the memory in the first place. The words are load-bearing. Without them, there is no scaffold for the experience to attach to. Babies have no language, not one word. They experience the world in raw, unmediated sensation. Warmth, hunger, sound, fear, real and vivid, every single one of them. But without language to give them structure, there is no framework for the brain to build on. The experiences dissolve as they form. This is why the earliest memories that do survive, usually surfacing from around age 2, tend to feel so fragmentary and strange. Not full scenes, not complete stories, just isolated pieces. A smell with no context attached to it. A color floating in the mind with nothing around it. A physical sensation of being carried that belongs to no specific day you can name. Your brain was collecting experience before it had any mechanism to organize that experience into something you could one day retrieve. And then there is a third layer. This is the one almost nobody talks about, and it is the most counterintuitive of the three. Even the fragile memory traces that do begin forming between ages 2 and 4 are not safe. Because during those years, the brain enters a period of explosive growth called synaptogenesis. New neurons are produced and new connections between them form at a rate the brain will never match again at any other point in your life. More connections should mean more storage, more capacity, more of everything getting preserved. But the opposite is true. When new neurons flood the hippocampus at that speed, they overwrite the fragile memory traces that were already forming. Think about writing something important in wet sand at the edge of the water. The wave arriving is not hostile. The ocean is simply growing, but the outcome is the same every time. Gone before the lines could set. Researchers found direct evidence for this mechanism in studies with mice. When they pharmacologically slowed new neuron production in young mice, those mice retained their early memories far longer than mice developing at a normal rate. The flood of new neurological growth was what was erasing the memories, not time, not the natural decay of old information. Growth itself. Your brain in those first years was building itself so rapidly, becoming so much so fast, that preserving what came before was simply not the developmental priority. The architecture of the next version of you took precedence over saving the current one. Now here is the question that sits underneath all of this and actually changes something. If you cannot consciously access those years, does that mean they did not shape you? Developmental psychology has a clear and well-established answer, and it is not a particularly comforting one. Those years shaped you more than any period that followed, more than adolescence, more than your first serious relationship, more than any experience you can sit down and describe in full sentences. The absence of accessible memory does not reduce their influence. If anything, it makes the influence harder to locate and trace, which makes it harder to examine critically, and far easier to mistake for fixed personality rather than formed response. Everything that happened before your memory could form, the emotional climate of the home you grew up in, whether you were soothed when you cried or left to manage it alone, whether love arrived consistently or came and went in ways you could not anticipate, whether those first years felt fundamentally safe or fundamentally uncertain, all of it landed in a developing nervous system that was recording in a completely different format, not as memories you can retrieve and examine, as patterns, as automatic responses, as the emotional baseline your entire nervous system still operates from today, decades later, in situations you may never consciously connect back to their origin. Psychologists distinguish this as implicit memory, separating it from explicit memory, which is the kind you can consciously retrieve and describe. Implicit memory does not live in the mind. It lives in the body, in the way your chest tightens before your thinking mind has even registered that something feels wrong, in the rules you formed early on about whether people are reliably safe, whether affection tends to come with conditions attached, whether you are fundamentally okay or quietly always bracing for something to shift. You cannot remember the moment those patterns were installed. You were present for every second of it, but you operate from them every single day, in who you choose to be close to, in what triggers you before you have language for why, in what feels like home before you have had time to think about whether it actually is. There is something that lands differently when you really sit with that. The years that formed you most completely are the ones you can never directly examine. You cannot revisit them with adult understanding. You cannot reframe what happened with the benefit of perspective. You can only observe the effects moving through you, sometimes years after the fact, in patterns that feel like personality, but were assembled under conditions you have no conscious access to. But the version of you that existed before memory had no armor either, no performance, no careful management of how you appeared to others. You reached for people without calculating whether it was safe to do so. You needed things without first framing the need as a liability. You felt everything directly, nothing intercepted between you and the arriving world. And somewhere below conscious memory, you still carry the shape of what that felt like. Every person who has ever made you feel genuinely safe without requiring you to earn it first has reached something from that period, not through a memory you can name, through something that recognizes before your thinking mind arrives at the same conclusion. Your nervous system moving towards something it once knew without reservation. So why can you not remember being a baby? Your hippocampus was not yet built to convert experience into long-term storage. You had no language to give raw sensation the structure that memory requires. And your brain was growing so fast during those early years that it overwrote fragile memory traces before they could consolidate into anything retrievable. But none of that changes what is actually true underneath it. You remember everything that mattered, just not consciously, in your body, in your patterns, in the automatic pull you feel towards certain people before you have assembled a rational explanation for it, in the love you recognize before you have found words for it. That baby in the photograph is still there. That is the ground floor. Every version of you since has been built directly on top of it. You are living inside it right now, in this moment, whether or not you can see it. If this gave you something real to think about, pass it on to someone who is still trying to understand why they are the way they are. This is Mind Theory. Thank you for staying to the end. Subscribe so you do not miss what we look at next.